So, welcome to session 2B in this 2021 History of Economics conference. My name is Nicolás Dvoskin. I'm from Argentina, and I'll be the chair of this session called Engineering the Economy. We have three presentations: Ivan Boldyrev, Realities of Formalization, How Soviet Scholars Moved from Control Engineering to the General Theory of Choice; Elizaveta Burina, The Socialist Planification Debate Inside Gosplan and Beyond; and Amanar Akhabbar, Wassily Leontief's Mobilization of the Input-Output Terminology, Input-Output Ratios from Engineering to Economics. As we've been talking, all three papers are quite related. So the idea is that we'll have all the presentations together so that we get to have quite a time for Q&A, comments, and discussion. So if you agree, we'll do the presentations in the order that's on the program, unless someone has a specific or special request on that. So Ivan, Elizaveta, and Amanar, the idea is to think of 15 minutes. If it's a little bit more and up to 20, it's okay. But think of 15, and after 20, we'll leave the screen for the next presenter. So if everything's all right and no one has anything to complain about, then we'll begin with the first presentation by Ivan Boldyrev.
Muted. Yeah. Do you hear me well? Is everything okay? Yeah.
Perfectly. Yes.
And you see my screen. Fantastic. So thank you for coming to this session. The motivation for my talk is that this is a longer project investigating, I would say, research cultures in Soviet mathematical economics, something I do with some co-authors like Alisa Kirchik or THU. We had a Hope volume on economic knowledge in socialism, and written some papers. And this paper I am presenting was published last year in another special issue of Hope on economics and engineering. And generally, the history of Soviet mathematical economics is a huge one and largely unwritten. But what interested us in the beginning were some cases of very open research landscape, in eclectic research landscape, in the absence of a theoretical hardcore. A curious case of doing mainstream research, because mathematical economics was obviously, after the war, the mainstream, or defined lots of mainstream strategies without actually being part of a mainstream. So sometimes some kind of a one-way street, and generally Cold War perspective, and some interactions via the Iron Curtain, which have not yet been sufficiently documented. An initial idea for this particular project, and why I was starting that, was it the case that the Soviet mathematical economists were speaking prose, so that they were developing some kind of mainstream theory without knowing that they were contributing to it? But this hypothesis was proven wrong. They were quite well aware of the Western literature, of what was happening in the West. They were following it. That's why I'm saying that was a one-way street. The West was not following what was happening in the Soviet Union for many reasons, but they did follow. And that transformed a bit in the question, what were the missed opportunities Soviet mathematical economists could pursue but did not? And my central figure in this particular paper is Mark Eiserman and his group. Eiserman graduated from the major Soviet engineering school before the war, immediately before the war, but was very, very bright engineer, control engineer, and then embarked upon academic work in the theory of automatic regulation, which basically is technical cybernetics or control engineering. And his whole career till the end of his life was connected to the Institute of Control Problems, which was one of the major institutions of Soviet cybernetics. He was an engineer, but he got a mathematical training from the famous Soviet mathematician Nicolás Luzin, who was actually persecuted, well, not persecuted, but let's say there was a famous Luzin affair, a case of academic repression. So Institute of Control Problems was the only institution that actually hosted Luzin and allowed him to work on his mathematical projects since the end of the 1930s. And that was okay. He was left alive and was not imprisoned. So Eiserman got his mathematical training from Luzin and developed a fascinating and very, very strange, in a sense, research agenda, starting with the analysis of mechanical systems and following the cybernetics hype of the 1950s and 1960s, was working on the theory of 8 automata and developing algorithms of visual perception and automatic classification and data analysis, which was important at that time, both on the theoretical and on the more practical scale. Then moving, so to say, or as it were, to the analysis of living systems and studying the problem of control in animals, so very much Wiener type cybernetics story, but also with his group, with his lab in this Institute of Control Problems, doing biological experiments and searching for living models of learning and pattern recognition. So interestingly, and then finally embarking upon the analysis of social systems. And the question is, of course, why was it economics? That was one of the questions I'm answering in this paper. So why he moved to economics and why he moved to this particular type of economics he chose. His scholars in his group or associated with his groups who were responsible for this move were Emanuel Braverman, on whom Olesya Kirchik wrote a separate paper in the volume I mentioned, who was working on cluster analysis and, interestingly, who developed one of the early fixed price disequilibrium economics models. A very insightful person who died early. Boris Mirkin, who is still alive, a very well-known computer scientist nowadays, but at that time was a qualitative mathematician working on the order problems and problems of classification and aggregation. This is his book, Group Choice, which was first published in Russian in 1974 and written in 1972, I believe, and translated relatively quickly into English and edited by the famous decision theorist Peter Fishburne. And Andrei Belishevsky, a very insightful decision theorist and operations researcher. So these were all quite bright people who were interested in different facets or aspects of economics and mathematical economics. So research agenda of Eiserman was strange. What could he do as a Soviet mathematical economist? Was it input-output, general equilibrium, operations research, or game theory, economic cybernetics? And the answer, no. None of these typical topics for Soviet mathematical economists were pursued, but rather social choice and general choice theory, as he called it. So his perspective was, to put it very quickly, was to analyze what he called choice functions, which is a map from the set of alternatives to the set of those alternatives that are chosen. This is a more general object, mathematical object, than what we have in the standard micro as an analysis of preferences. Eiserman and his group developed a general language for the theory of choice and generalized, in a sense, classical binary choice between alternatives formalizing the idea of what we now call context dependence of preferences. And I refer to Sen, and Sen refers to Eiserman's work, but Amartya Sen's ideas on that are quite well known in economics. Now, the research culture followed within the group was quite interesting. Eiserman was a socialist in his beliefs, but he was also a communist of ideas. The group worked really as a collective. And as a collective, it was very much, it shared its results. It was interesting that they kind of did not attribute the results to individual researchers. They kind of learned from each other, and the result was the result of the lab or of the group and not of individual researchers. But at the same time, Eiserman followed probably the arrow impossibility theorem, which he so thoroughly investigated, was a dictator in terms of the research agenda. He defined the research agenda for this whole group and then gave tasks to particular members. And if people were not happy with this research, they were forced to leave the group or forced to change their research in terms of Eiserman's own interests. So this research culture also kind of, contributed or reinforced the idea of unifying the language of the choice theory so that the language itself becomes common. Eiserman had a curious issue of changing radically the research direction every 7 years, or so he believed. So just probably to make life amusing. The international collaboration of the group was impressive. One of the very early visitors of the Caltech Humanities and Social Sciences groups in California, in Charles Plot, where they visited Charles Plot, was from this Institute of Control Sciences, and people like Amartya Sen, David Gale, Theodore Groves, and Stephen Brahms, and other notable formal political theorists. So people who defined the mainstream both in economics and in formal political theory were constant partners and interlocutors of the group. Of course, social choice and formal political theory were next to impossible to legitimize as research topics in the USSR of the late 70s, early 80s, when the Eiserman's team was operating. There was an anecdote that they had to censor themselves and to not use the words dictator or oligarchy in one of their papers in the early 1980s, which is of course a bit overemphasized, but still kind of reveals the level of self-censorship they were undergoing. Some theorems in Mirkin's book, actually developed by Malishevsky, had clearly a subversive potential, but were masked as just theorems in the group choice or collective choice. There were a difference. Theory, and in this sense, formalism was used, and this is well known, that formalism could be used as both research and survival strategy. So, and their curious position was that they were a part of the mainstream in terms of the type of work they're doing, and were not, because they were not actually going regularly to the conferences, did not pursue common research projects with the Western economists, and in a sense, despite the best possible conditions, there was no real integration into the Western economics. The approach itself had its limitations, was too general and not very practical, but this was only one reason for that. When in the 1987, Herbert Simon, Robert Axelrod, and other famous economists and political scientists who were parts of the Committee on Contributions of Behavioral Social Sciences to the Prevention of Nuclear War came to the USSR, They also came to Eiserman's group, and their report, part of which is demonstrated on this slide, kind of showed that actually Eiserman was still doing purely theoretical research, although there were, again, all kinds of, prerequisites for him doing social choice theory, experimental economics, or market design. In terms of intellectual prerequisites, that was fully possible, and that was the agenda Charles Plot pursued in the United States, but not Eiserman. Could they have succeeded? This is the final question I'm asking. We could argue that Eiserman's group was one of the most internationalized and recognized internationally in Soviet economics, or better to say, mathematical economics, which was very much a synonym for economics in the mainstream. That was its strength, but also its weakness. And I speculate a bit on that, going beyond the paper as such. Soviet mathematical economics was actually as eclectic as Eiserman's multiple interests. As his colleague recalled, Eiserman learned the basics of mathematical logic, theory of stochastic processes, electrophysiology, principles of math economics, and elements of relativist physics, which he actually taught at the Moscow Physical Technical Institute. But no unifying theoretical framework was present in the Soviet mathematical economics that would be close to what we had in Samuelson's Foundations or Debreu's theory of value. Members of Eiserman's lab were quite skeptical as to the possibilities of theory of optimal planning, which was the mainstream of the Soviet theoretical mathematical economics, and were not very interested in empirical or applied part of math economics, like in the Soviet case, input-output analysis. So they could not find enough support at home, neither in theoretical nor in applied sense, and that actually they were trapped in this Soviet mathematical economics camp, being both within and outside, and in this sense, institutionally, they could not succeed either. So that's basically the major narrative of my story. I would be happy to answer questions if you have them. I hope I did not use too much time for my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much for the sharpness of the time. You took 16 minutes, so it was perfect timing. So really thank you for that. For all people who just joined the session, welcome. We decided we'll do all the presentations together at the beginning, so we'll leave room for the questions later. So if you have questions for Ivan, just write them down. And I think we're very few, so I think it will be better for the questions to open up the mics and the camera so that we can talk. So no need, if someone has a connectivity problem, you can write them down in the chat, but I think it's better if we just see our faces and talk. So feel free to open up the mic when we get to that moment. So continuing with the program, now it's time for Elizaveta Burina, the socialist planification debate inside Gosplan and beyond. Elizaveta, you have your time.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. I'm going to make it up like this. So this is the title of my today's presentation, but I will, in the talk, focus mainly on the debates inside Gosplan, because to analyze the whole socialist planification discussion in the early Soviet Union, I won't have enough time. So this is the outline, and let's just get straight to it. These are the research questions that I'm raising in the paper. So I'm interested in the methodological discussions among the Soviet economists involved into the socialist planification during the years of the new economic policy. This is very important. This is the period that I'm limiting myself to. And actually, well, 1921 was the beginning of the new economic policy, and formally it ended in 1931. But I'm taking 1921 as the end of the period under consideration, because 1929 was 28 even was the year of so-called Great Break, as Stalin named it, the switch towards the forced industrialization and collectivization of the Soviet economy. So the sub-questions, well, the questions are, what were the main methodological discussions? So it's important, it's more about the methods other than economic policy. And how they evolved during the considered period. And then the second question, which I would like to address more, but so far haven't addressed, I think, enough. What was the general attitude towards the use of mathematical methods? My motivation is, first of all, I've always been fascinated with the period of the very beginning of this biggest socialist experiment. It is still quite crazy for me to imagine the challenges that the people who actually worked on the plans faced, whatever their political, ideological views were. So this is the very beginnings of socialist, communist planification. And the new economic policy is at the same time very interesting, because it presented actually a combination of free market elements within with the socialist planned economy. I'll introduce a little more briefly the new economic policy right now. And well, within the period that I chose, the ideological control was relatively mild. So even though we still have to be conscious about the censorship and the wordings that the economists used, it was generally allowed to write, to express the opinions. And then for me, this particular paper is an element of the context that I use for my thesis, which is on the general mathematical models used by the economists of that period. Mainly, I'm focusing on Vladimir Bazarov so far. So I was just wondering what kind of context was he working in, and did that context affect his findings and his methodology, or it was the other way around? How was it? So the sources that I'm using for the bigger study are the economic journals, not only the Planned Economy, which was the main journal of Gosplan, the planification agency, but also Economic Review, Statistical Review, the relevant text published by Gosplan economists, and the publication of Kondratьev's Business Cycle Institute that I'm not discussing today, but these are the sources for the bigger research. And now let me just talk a little bit about the new economic policy. The main measures that were actually suggested and introduced by Lenin in March 1921 were first the switch to продналог, so-called for the rural areas, for the peasants, which pretty much allowed the farmers to earn profits. So they were only taken, as Lenin said, the minimum of what was needed for the army. And then the surplus that they were left with, they could still trade themselves, which was not the case before the new economic policy, so during the war communism time. All the surplus, and even more than surplus, was taken from the peasants, which left the whole rural area starving. And that was one of the reasons of switching to NEP. Then concession agreements to attract foreign investment was another measure. And then even the state-owned companies were now allowed to distribute the profits in favor of the employees. Well, that's what they said, but that was the idea, right? Which somehow stimulated the more efficient production management of the enterprises. And then allowing private small-scale trade, including and mainly agriculture, but also small artisanship, so on and so forth, which created a free market within the emerging socialist state. And Gosplan was one of the agencies, it was the main agency that worked on planification. In the very beginning, Gosplan was, so in 1921, Gosplan was born together with NEP, New Economic Policy. It had 40 staff members, and only like 25, only a quarter of them were Communist Party members. The rest were old school, I'm writing here, engineers and professors, a lot of engineers. So this shows that the priority was on the expertise rather than political views in the beginning, in the very beginning of the Gosplan. So that's why it's also interesting for me, which it created some sort of free speech, well, to a certain extent, obviously, environment. And the leaders in 1921 and the beginning were the educated elites. So here, this is Gleb Krzyżanowski. He was an engineer as well. Before he was leading the agency that developed the plans for the electrification of the Soviet Union. So this whole framework should give you the idea of the general environment. It stimulated all sorts of debates. And I am generally, and after the analysis of these debates, I split them into 3 periods. The first is 1921-1924. This is the period of the search for methods. In almost every article published in Planned Economy, you could read, we don't know what to do. We have not yet defined the methodology, but this is what we're doing. This is how we're trying to move on. And what were the main characteristics of economic policy? Because this is important. The directive of Lenin to the Gosplan economists and the just general economic authorities was improving the rural economy that was completely destroyed. The starvation was just everywhere. For it to feed the urban sector and allow industrialization. And that was the idea for the planification as well. So the allowed free trade within the within the agriculture was the economic reality that the planners faced. And this led to an emerging issue of price scissors, which means the prices of the manufacturing goods are increasing. So the top one is manufacturing goods and the bottom one is agricultural goods. So in a sense, this shows you the worsening of the position and conditions of the villages of the rural area. And that was a problem to face in that very beginning of the period that Gosplan operated. What were the main methodological discussions? The ambitions of Gosplan's leaders were to find a generalized quantitative laws that they could use to at least base their predictions on something. And here I'm giving the quote, which is somehow related to this idea. Just as higher mathematics operating with algebraic concepts is for the first time able to describe complex dynamic processes with concise formulas, the center of gravity, the main purpose in work of creating national economic plan, is reduced to such a generalizing work. But in reality, what was happening within this period, it was just the balance sheets of the USSR in general, balance sheets of certain republics, balance sheets. So the mathematical methods and these quantitative laws were reduced to pretty much accounting identities. An emerging issue was the construction of indices, price indices mainly, because this, what I was showing you, is based on the price indices as well. So the debate was going around the construction of indices. And of course, all this led to an increasing importance of mathematical statistics and the statistical methods. So how do we work with the data that we somehow managed to collect? And then the emerging issue was, it started emerging in 1924, which approach is better to use, at least in the beginning? Still a positive approach, trying to describe the economy as it is, or starting with a normative approach, so just defining the objectives and whatever it takes, getting to them. The next period was a period of substantive discussions. It was very interesting. Like every issue of planned economy is just in itself an object of study. This weird, eclectic, we can say, methods that were used in the beginning, balance sheets, some sort of statistical smoothing of the data series, all these things that certain economists were suggesting needed to be systemized and summarized. And I think the article published in 1924, here I didn't state it, it was, 1924 by Vladimir Bazarov, was some sort of the attempted systematization of that methodologies. So Bazarov suggested the two types of planification: genetic, which is pretty much extrapolation of the trends in existing economy, and that the genetic as a basis for the plan. So we extrapolate what we have, and that's how we plan the future. And teleological, which is based on the objectives of the authorities. So it's more of a normative approach. Bazarov himself stated that genetic planning was supposed to serve agricultural sector because in the agricultural sector, there was a free market. There was some sort of free market in the years of NEP. And teleological planification was supposed to serve the manufacturing industry, so the state-owned industries. And that point of view sparked a lot of discussions. And here I'm just presenting one point of view of Strumilin, who stated that, well, genetic planification was only possible for the short run because the socialist economy was supposed to do, we all know what, overtake the capitalist world. So without the long run objectives, even in the agricultural sector, there was no plan. So for Strumilin, the plan was that directives. On top of the discussions, genetic versus teleological, there was a discussion around the concept of optimization. It was the first, around 1924, we could, in planned economy, for the first time see the use of the word optimal. And Bazarov was again the first to sort of formalize the approach to what we call optimal. He stated that the optimal development of the economy, so the criteria of optimality is threefold. So it has to ensure a smooth development with no crisis. That was according to Bazarov, a good thing about socialist economy, that unlike the capitalist economy, it would not run into crisis. The second was the development that would conserve the necessary proportions between the industries. And of course, the last one is that the optimal path of development is the shortest path, the fastest with the given resources. Then on top of the optimization discussion, we could trace the purely like empirical econometric discussions on the use of mathematical statistics, especially after the publication of certain Kondratьev's works. And you could also notice that the section criticism in the planned economy was expanding and expanding and expanding. So in the end of 1927, there was a bunch of criticism, which means lively discussion. Economists were discussing, Gosplan economists were discussing each other's works, and also criticizing the bourgeois methods. So that was something that actually is leading me to the next and the last period. The use of mathematical methods that was generally welcomed at Gosplan in the beginning, by the end of the period, started being widely criticized. And I see the reasons of it in actually the switching from NEP towards the forced industrialization. There were just too many powerful opponents of the new economic policy, and things were evolving very fast. The price seizures problem was still there. And together with the new economic policy and its like capitalist elements, also some sort of capitalist methods, if we can have capitalist methods, bourgeois, as they liked saying, methods in economics, were criticized. And what were those methods? All the methods of formalized quantitative approach to development, smooth data series, which is pretty much a simple statistical econometrical thing, extrapolation of trends, empirical laws, slowing growth pace. This was the last one, was an attack on Bazarov's findings. It was a targeted attack on what he was doing. So these methods were some kind of associated to the Western economies. Methodological implications were the teleological approach, of course, won, and mathematical methods, here we go, criticized. Statistical methods associated with the name of Kondratьев were also criticized. A little star here, I wanted to say that, well, not all mathematical methods were criticized, but only those that led certain economists to make conclusions that were not welcomed by the Communist Party leaders. And for the further discussion, I'm sorry, it could have been a bit messy. I tried to go as fast as possible on this huge topic. What I found in the end was that separating methodological discussion from the political discussion was tricky. Initially, I wanted to purely analyze the methodological side, but once we hit this genetic teleological problem, we inevitably hit the problem of market versus centralized planning. Another interesting thing for the further discussion, which I discovered recently, was this attitude and the understanding of the socialist planning by its creators, by Gosplan economists and others, as an engineering project or more of a natural sciences project. So in case of, for example, Vladimir Bazarov, to him, it was not, I cannot say that it was a purely natural sciences project, but he used the methods of natural sciences, like he imported to economics the differential equations from chemistry to describe the pace of recovery process of Soviet economy. To him, it was a valid method. To Strumilin, for example, and many others, socialist planning was actually an engineering project. And this is a pretty curious quote. I found it, and I think it's nicely fitting into the section. Building of socialist plans, as well as much more elementary art of building, should be viewed as a kind of engineering art and not as a science in the strict sense of the word. The idea is that there's no only one possible optimal way, maximize the utility under constraint way to socialist planning. Strumilin said another engineer can come and suggest a better strategy, right? So this was something that was not obviously a central discussion, but it could be a good direction for further research of like methodological part of socialist planification discussions inside the Gosplan and of course beyond. Thank you. I hope I fit in time.
Thank you, Elizaveta. Yeah, it's kind of 25 minutes, but it's okay. You took Ivan's minutes, so the average is still going well. So thank you for the presentation. And now we'll go to Amanar's presentation. Okay. And you don't have any minutes to borrow. Elizaveta used all of them. Go ahead.
I hope I will not ruin the average time. Okay, so first, I need to share my thing. So I'm not very comfortable with with the Zoom. Sorry. So okay, I think I have to say. Oh yeah, I didn't do that before. I should.
You have to use this green button on the bottom. Yeah, and then you have to choose what you're sharing. If it's the whole screen, if it's just a window.
Okay, I see my computer forgot my preferences. That's too bad.
No, we lost him. Okay, we have lost.
He had to restart probably Zoom, because if you want to change the sharing preference on a Mac, you need to restart Zoom.
Well, you know that. So, well, hi everyone again.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay, so this time I should be able to share. Okay, so this time it worked. I think it works. Here we go. You should be able to see, right? Excellent. To see my slides. Okay. So here we go. Okay. The title of this presentation is Wassily Leontief's mobilization of the input-output terminology, and I have a subtitle about input-output ratios from engineering to economics. Okay, so it's related to the previous presentations because Wassily Leontief was Russian born, but most or all that I will say will be about his works in the United States. But it's also about engineering. So the focus is about, I start from terminology. These words, input, output, are puzzling for me. And I had a paradox to solve because actually Leontief did not coin the expression input-output analysis. It's not coming, it didn't come from him. And when it came to be used, input-output analysis in the 1940s, he was not so comfortable with this expression, input-output analysis. And yet everybody knows his work as being input-output analysis. So there was something to be clarified about the terminology. And I finally had to understand where does this input-output terminology comes from. And the result, so I can tell you what is the result, is that first, it helps to understand why Leontief actually did what he did, that is to say, measure some technical coefficients. So when you look at this terminology paradox, you can better understand that. You can also better understand why he ended up pushing for engineering production functions at Harvard. So that's a second result that helps to understand how he came to these engineering production function. And also it sheds lights on his well-known attack of economics as being too abstract, and his push for direct observation, for using data from engineers and things like that. So that's the result. The outline goes as follows. First, I will say a few words about this input-output terminology. Then I will try to convince you that it comes from engineering and it went to economics. And third, I will try to explain how it's related to a very specific concept in economics, which are technical coefficients. It comes from Walras, actually. So how is connected these two things, the input-output ratios of engineers. And finally, I will try to answer about, is it a physics transfer or is it an engineering transfer? It's related also to the volume edited by Ivan he talked about before. So, okay, so first, Leontief didn't coin the expression input-output analysis, but he mobilized these input-output words. First, in his first paper on inter-industry method in 1936. This is in the title of the paper, and I can read this title: Quantitative Input and Output Relation in the Economic System of the United States. So it's immediately in the title, he mobilized these words, input and output. But actually, when you read the article, you don't find a systematic use of this vocabulary. He doesn't use systematically input and output. He used many other expressions to talk about what is consumed to produce some commodities. It's scarcely used inside the paper, and it's quite the same in the second paper he published in 1937. You have the title here, where he used a little bit the input-output vocabulary, but not that much. So the thing is, what did he say when he wanted to talk about input and output? First, you find input and output when he talks mostly about the tables. So for instance, you have this table of coefficients of production in 1936, or on the left, you can see that on the left there is outlays and in brackets only input. So input seems to be something really specific, a very technical term, And usually what he used, not only in this paper, but also in his previous papers, like in German in 1929, he says something about production factors. I don't read it in German. In 1932, also in German, cost elements, cost factors. And actually, usually this is how he talks about the inputs. He doesn't say inputs, he says cost goods, cost elements, cost factors, outlays, outgoes, things like that. So inputs, especially the word input more than output, that was more common, seem very specific. So what I try to do is to understand, to contextualize this terminology. So at the time of Leontief, 1936, in the 1930s, who did use this word input, especially input, to talk about cost element of or factors of production? So here you have a very simple, naive search in JSTOR about the use of input. And if you look at the right, you can see that in 1960, you had 339 papers using the word input, while, for instance, in the first 2 decades, only 1 paper used the word input. So there's been some kind of spread of input, of the term input. And in the 1930s, only a few, very few papers used the word input. And if you compare that with today, so this is at the bottom of my slide, in the last decade, for instance, if you focus on the articles, economic articles containing the words factors of production, almost half of them also use input. So if an economist today talks about factors of production, 1 time out of 2, he will also say the word input, which was absolutely not the case in the 1930s, where you had 6% only. The connection was really weak. So it was a very specific word, input, and this is interesting because it will help to find why Leontief used this specific word and where it comes from. And then, since Leontief gives almost no clue about what he is doing, where he found the information, what is his inspiration, and all that, it's very useful. And one thing is, for instance, let's have a look at the definition of input, output. And the definition, for instance, is to say that it comes from computer science. And as a matter of fact, Leontief is the first economist, one of the first, at least, economists who used the computer. And here you have it's not really a computer, but it's a machine. Here you have one machine of his colleague at MIT with whom he worked, Vannevar Bush. And in this machine, indeed, there is something called the input table. So you put the input, you have an output. So maybe the vocabulary comes from here, but it doesn't really make sense. I will not elaborate on that, but there is a connection, but I don't think it's enough to understand why Leontief used the expression input and output in his table. So what I did is to try to find where it comes from, and my insight is that it leads me to this paper of 1924 of 3 economists of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, the BAE, Tolley, Black, Ezekiel, who had a bulletin titled Input as related to output in farm organization and cost of production studies. So here I find it way more convincing that it's related to what Leontief was doing, and maybe when he says input output, it's a reference to that. So especially because in this paper, the authors study input output relations in production processes, and they coined the expression input output analysis, input output studies, input output relations, and things like that. So is it connected to Leontief? Actually, in a paper published this month, I already explained that. So yes, it's related because Leontief was close to Ezekiel. John Black was at Harvard when Leontief was there, and in his 1936 paper, Leontief makes an explicit reference, not to this paper, but to agricultural works and research, saying that this is what we should do, they are doing the right thing and things like that. So there is a connection. I don't have time to explain that more, but there is a connection. And so the question is, what were these input-output works before Leontief's input-output works? So here I'm going back in time, and I found that okay, this is the kind of things you can find. So they were working on some kind of diminishing returns and trying to find curves between inputs and outputs and things like that. And if you try to see who introduced that, it's the founder of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, Henry Taylor, in the 1917 paper about productivity. And it helps a lot when you look at this article, because he was concerned with the efficiency of farms and how to improve efficiency, productivity, and all that. And he was working on that for almost 20 years. And then in this article, he explained, I borrow the ingenious concept of efficiency as defined as an input-output ratio. And here it gives a key to understand what is this input-output thing, terminology. And he explains well that he used this engineering concept of efficiency as a ratio between the output and the input, or conversely, depending on what you want to measure. So then, what is that? What is that engineering input-output efficiency? I went back to the literature in engineering, and I found that in the late 19th century, in the years 1880s, US engineers, it's quite specific to the US, started to use this expression about input-output efficiency, input-output ratios for a very specific problem. They had to practically measure accurately the efficiency of the devices they were building, especially in electric devices, such as transformers and things like that. So there is a whole literature about how to measure and how to design experiments to measure the efficiency. And so this input-output view approach to efficiency is really related to an experimental and practical problem. And they also have this question about not only the technical efficiency, but as we will see, the economic efficiency. But first, here, for instance, an example of 1893 about testing. So they do input-output tests. For instance, they coined the expression input-output test. So how to measure input, how to measure output. And below you can see at the bottom that there is a ratio between the output and the input. And you can find in time more and more of these articles. They create efficiency curve, input curve. So you have measurements of inputs, outputs, and the ratios between the two. And actually the agricultural economists really used exactly all this framework. And here you can see this curve that shows some kind of diminishing return, diminishing return in the process. And so there's a discussion about either a natural law of diminishing returns. So this is directly related. And then there's been a spread of this engineering concept. So first the engineers were trying to see what are the costs. So they were trying to measure the different ratios to measure the cost of different kind of devices. But it went beyond engineering. And here you can see, for instance, you have two columns showing that you can have among the inputs time, money, and things like that. And in the output, you can have salable goods, health, recreation. So it spread way beyond engineering, but with always this concern for measurement. And here you have an economic analysis based on this input-output concept. So there was this whole literature about this input-output concept. And I will be quite short on the last two parts. The thing is, now, okay, there is this engineering thing. It's related to agricultural economics. Now, how does it relate to technical coefficients? And here, here actually it's explicit. It's explicit because, for instance, Henry Moore, Henry Schultz, working on Walras-Pareto general equilibrium, they simply explain that you have a quote here. Coefficients of production basically can be measured as input and output ratio. So it's pretty simple. They made the connection in the 1920s. So this is 1929. You recognize the Walras ratio, and here Schultz explained that we can use the input per output from engineers. And he explains that the greatest difficulty in the way of verification of the economic laws is the lack of reliable data, especially, I skip, what is greatly needed is a series of well-planned experiments on the relation between input and output coefficient of production in various fields of production. So basically, they kind of launched the kind of input-output studies Leontief would do. Here you have, again, a diagram showing the relation between output and input in a Walras framework. And then it's not, now we understand naturally how naturally Leontief came into that and used this specific input-output ratio. And he also used an efficiency coefficient. So the thing is, and I will conclude on that, the thing is, following this input-output terminology, it helps, I don't know if it's a physics transfer, but at least there is maybe some kind of merger between all the Walrasian tradition, but around coefficients of production and the engineers' input-output efficiency ratios. And this merger really was complete when Leontief launched works at the end of the 1940s on the engineering production functions with two of his students, Hollis Chenery and Ann Carter, and at the Harvard Economic Research Project. So here you have a very short view of the kind of engineering production functions Chenery produced in 1949. And at the time, it seemed promising. You have a quote here of Johansen, who said that the time series used to estimate production function do not work, and we should better use this kind of engineering or technical production function. But even more than that, to me, the transfer is also a transfer of method, because I think Leontief really thought that the measurement method, experimental method you can find at on the side of the engineers, and especially in agricultural economics, were the kind of works we had to do in economics in all the branches, not only agricultural, but also, I don't know, health, manufacturers, plants, power plants, and all that. So this was his model. And when you read Leontief's arguments saying that economics is not empirical enough, it makes more sense when you understand where it comes from, I think. So came his motto, ask an engineer. So I think now it kind of makes sense. Okay, I think it was longer than my
Thank you very much, Amanar, for your presentation. I think all of you for your very interesting presentations. And so we'll move to the Q&A moment. I see Elizaveta has raised her hand. Maxime has as well. So you are all invited to raise your hands if you want to ask a question or make a comment. I recommend we'll first start with the comments by people who are not presenters. So and then we'll make a round of comments and answers from the presenters if you agree with that. So feel free to write your names in the chat, and I'll open the mic. So I'll give the word. So please, Maxime, if you want to start with your comment, question, or whatever.
No, actually, I didn't have any question. I just applauded. I didn't put any raise hand.
It was an applause. I thought it was like a raise your hand. I'm not familiar with this I was like, yes, it's diagonal or straight hand. That's also the question. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Elizaveta, was that your case as well? Or do you want to make a comment?
Actually, it was, but I also have a question.
Okay, so if we just start. Sorry, yes, I see they are very similar. The applause and the raised hands. So sorry for that. So yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So my question will be to Ivan. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was actually trying to connect the title of your presentation to the content of it. And maybe I just missed something very important, but could you elaborate a little more? Like, was there some sort of actually switching from the control engineering in the approaches of something like they were doing practical, or it was just pretty much about the group of Eiserman and their interests and his pretty much change of interest?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was so quick, and of course it was not, I could not really elaborate on everything, but they were control engineers, okay? So their background was control engineering, not only of Eiserman, but of many other of his colleagues, etc. So you look at the group of control engineers embarking upon economics and trying to do something in economics. What would they do? And my natural expectation, and generally the expectation, that's why I'm talking about missed opportunities, would be that they would do what we today understand under economic engineering. And economic engineering today, or economics as engineering today, is associated to market design, is associated to related experimental techniques, is associated with all kinds of, engineering institutions. And that they would transform that, and experimental techniques they used in solving engineering tasks, because that was also present, because cybernetics involved some experimentations with a living systems, at least in Eiserman's lab. So my expectation would be, well, that was Soviet mechanism design or Soviet market design, but there were no markets to design. There were no engineering projects to really implement as far as social systems were concerned. So that's why I'm talking about the so-called missed opportunity. And what he did instead was radical formalization. And that's why this explains also not only the subtitle, but also the title of the talk. Formalization, which somehow goes to extremes and is now occasionally cited in technical papers, but not really became, part of the larger market design movement for the reasons I'll try to reconstruct. I hope it answers at least partly your question. Thank you.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So we have now, yes, two people from the audience who have raised their hands, Ivanka and Ivan. So Ivanka, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you so much to all three of you for a very fascinating panel. I have a question for Elizaveta, but if anyone else feels that it's relevant to their research as well, please feel free to chime in. So I'm curious about this methodological debate that you mentioned between genetic and teleological optimization, and to what extent that debate happened outside of this core group of economists within Gosplan. My very amateur understanding of the Soviet economy in this period is that there were many levels and managers were involved, and there was this complex infrastructure. And so I'm curious how they participated in this conversation, if they did at all, and for the other speakers as well. How did these conversations happen outside of groups of the core economists? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we will move to Ivan's comment or question.
Hi, yeah, thanks everyone for a really interesting presentations. I also have a question for Elizaveta, and it's in response to a comment that you made at the end of your presentation where you talked about the sort of inseparability between questions of maybe science and then political considerations. And I specifically am wondering about, I mean, maybe this goes beyond sort of a methodological consideration, but as far as, you know, people who are taking part in this debate had to come up with some kind of target outputs, there had to be some kind of choice about which industry or which industries to have more targets, you know, which industry should be targeted. And I know that in the period of the new economic policy, there was a big debate about, I mean, between like Bukharin and Preobrazhensky about whether to prioritize investment in industry versus agriculture and rates of investment and et cetera. But yeah, it's just kind of like a comment about were these, in these methodological considerations, are they taking targets as sort of given from the political objectives of the Communist Party? Because I mean, prioritizing where to put targets is clearly a political question, but is that also kind of like a science economic question that would be considered in a methodological question? Because I mean, if you're just thinking about purely how to have the economy function and how to industrialize, you have to prioritize where to put investment, et cetera.
Thanks, Ivan. Ivanka, you have another question?
Sorry, now I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay. So Amanar, do you have questions for your colleagues or do you want to answer?
No, I have a question to Elizaveta.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you you said a lot, and that was really interesting. And I wondered about the electricity plan, the GOELRO, and what were the instruments used, and was it did the Gosplan follow the method of the GOELRO, or did the Gosplan try to find something different than the planning of electricity? And I also wonder if the teams were connected. You also said something about the, I think this is the head of the electricity plan, Krizanovsky, right? Do not pronounce well. So I wondered if he elaborated on his view of planning. Did he say a lot about what was his conception of planning? Because I remember there were some references by Lenin to Karl Ballod, the utopian view, German. So I don't know if they used Ballod. Atlanticus was his name for his books on planning. Okay, so that's the first set of questions. And the other question I had is a question I was asked when I worked on Russian sources of Leontief. And some people said, you know, you should not rely on the Western works on the USSR, especially what was published in the 1960s. For instance, I'm thinking of Spulber, Aleknov, and many other sources. And do you think they are reliable? That's my other question. And maybe Ivan can answer too. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question myself. I think it's for the three of you, and it has to do with the all of you have presented discussions regarding analysis or how to analyze production, how to analyze the supply side of economics somehow. So I'm not asking about demand, but my question is the following. What is the reading? What are the readings that you could find regarding, for instance, neoclassical productive functions? So, because you're all showing alternatives or other different paradigms which may or may not have had to struggle with orthodoxy or merely neoclassical economics, which and specifically with the production function. I think Amanar has presented some discussions on input output ratios, and that could lead us maybe to some discussions. But my question is general for the three of you. So are there readings on the production functions that could be used as stimulus for further criticisms or for discussions in the authors that you were analyzing, which of course are related to other schools of thought or other paradigms on the supply side of economics? That's my question. Are there any other questions around from the audience, from the presenters to each other? No? Well, maybe we'll have time for that for a second round. So now I'll suggest we'll do a round of answers. Maybe we can start with Elizaveta. You've had a lot of questions to face, and then we'll continue with the rest.
Thank you. So the first question was of Ivanka about whether the discussion of genetic teleological took somehow some sort of place outside of Gosplan. And actually, I would say that it was at first like an artificial, I don't know, like division of the methods of planning, but suggested by Bazarov and picked up by other Gosplan economists. And well, it was discussed in the local agencies of Gosplan, but I do not quite know, maybe it's just something that I don't know and have to look into it, that this discussion was among other like agencies or economists or outside of this planning block of the agencies. So I think what was like interesting also about it, and what I can connect to the next question about how the targets were set or used and modeled or planned, was that the idea of the synthesis of genetic and teleological in the beginning was quite strong. Then and later on it switched to like, no, we just do completely teleological planning. And what Bazarov was saying, I just know a little more about him other than other economists, because I was working on him a lot. He was saying that yes, well, certainly the directives, like for example the growth rates of industry, they should come from the party leaders, right? But we should be aware as planners, as an advisory board, because Gosplan had the status of an advisory board. We should be aware and we should make sure to tell them whether it makes sense or not. That is why we need the basis of genetic planning for our agricultural sector, for our markets where we still have them during the NEP. So we should know how the potential of the economy that is there, and then analyze where these targets actually make sense or not. So yeah, I think that answers at least partly the question, and I tried to combine the two. About the Goelro, actually Gosplan was the daughter of Goelro. It was transformed, so that's why Krzyżanowski, he was a director of Goelro, and he became a director of Gosplan. And I can say that at least what he says himself is that he greatly used all the data collected for the electrification plan and the balance sheets that they used, because there was not much of like methods or functions already created, or even like empirical curves built a little. really not much. So electrification plan was more than just electrification plan, of course, because it involved the building of the roads. It also involved the military industry somehow. So it was the beginnings. It was like the precursor of the Gosplan, and they started building the plans, at least somehow, mainly in a form of balance sheets. So the way that they are right now, the changes within the planned period in between the elements of this balance sheet and the outcome, the balance sheet at the end of the planned period. So I think, well, that also answers partly the connection between Gosplan and Godreau. First of all, the director, which was the same, and the data that they greatly used. And about the Western sources, well, I myself made a great use of Alexander Ehrlich's book, the Soviet industrialization debate, which I find quite reliable. And with the rest, I don't know, obviously, since I read Russian, I don't have any problem of reading the primary sources, and maybe not spend as much time reading the Western sources. But yeah, so I can only say for the Soviet industrialization debate of Ehrlich, which I read both in Russian and in English, and it kind of like helped me to structure also my discussion on the debates within Gosplan, which I try to make more methodological, right? Because Soviet industrialization debate is a lot about politics, and even the conclusion is that all these decisions were somehow political. There was a lot of rivalry. So yeah, I try to make it more into the math methods, and eventually shifted kind of to the same ideas of who wants to take power. Okay, and I don't have any answer for the production function question, because when you started, Nicolás, asking the question, I was thinking maybe you actually wanted to shift it towards the demand side, because that was something interesting in Bazarov. But yeah, no, thank you. Sorry for talking to my.
Sorry for creating wrong expectations with my question. So who wants to go on? Amanar or Ivan? It's your choice.
Ivan, you had the question first. I think it's for you.
Well, I think it's Amanar's more relevant, and I have a very short comment, so it's probably Amanar who has a more elaborate answer.
About the production function?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so okay, my opinion, it's just an opinion, is that if we talk about the, let's say, interwar 1920s, 1930s, or even the first half of the 12th century, I would say that, remember, was there a mainstream? I don't think so. It was pluralism. So you remember the Hope special issue from pluralism to neoclassical, which I find very true, actually. So for instance, if you look at the book of Stigler, published in 1941 about, I don't remember, production theory and something like that, he reviews all the great theory, and there are many of them. It's not like a microeconomic textbook. You have Walras, you have Jevons. Jevons and Walras have two totally different theories of production. Marshall, John G.B. Clark, Pareto, and so forth. And you can continue with different authors. So you have different schools. And before World War II, the Austrian school was very, very important. And what I find is very often I find references to this kind of dynamic approach of production, where you have goods that are transformed in time. And my feeling is that if there were a mainstream, that almost would be that this was very strong, this view, because it was kind of realistic, this view of a process in time that transforms goods into consumption goods. Leontiev was totally against that, but it was something you could not avoid. You had to say something about that, and you find actually even Leontiev at some point tried to create some model like that with you have production that takes time, and he gave up. But so all the Austrian school was very strong, but I think it was a time of pluralism, and that's very important. And if you have two pillars, for instance, maybe there are two pillars for the production function, like something that would be marginal productivity theory and the diminishing or increasing returns. So these are the two things, and then you have very different creations on that. So that would be my answer.
And I could only add that my work, the work I was considering, was more foundations of the demand theory and not really production function. And in that, the only heterodoxy, I mean, they did not like, obviously, orthodox choice theory due to Arrow's impossibility theorem, but also due to all kinds of other issues. So the heterodox school closer to them was less neo-Ricardianism and much more behavioral economics or Herbert Simon type of work. Okay. And as for Spilber and Alec Nove, I could only comment that, well, they were trying their best to do a good research in not being able to observe in the field, Soviet economy in the field, but basically I would find them much more reliable than the writings of Soviet economists of that time, frankly speaking, when we talk about 50s and 60s, etc. And it's better to sit, there was this saying, it's better to stand for, and it's better to stand for higher rates of growth than to sit for lower rates of growth, whereby to sit means means basically to be imprisoned in Russian. So yeah, that was the problem. Yeah.
But sorry, Elizaveta and Ivan, do you hear this? It's not a critic, but do you hear that? Oh, you should not trust this or that. Is it a problem? No. Okay.
I mean, there is a certain skepticism towards Sovietology as a Cold War phenomenon, if it is what you were referring to, and
yeah,
it's
completely
completely understandable. Yes, of course, it was a Cold War phenomenon, but I think they were at least kind of, making their assumptions explicit. So I would not take them at face value in everything they write, but in terms of, I don't know, trying to reconstruct Soviet decision-making on the enterprises, or trying to, find out how to reconstruct Soviet statistics in a more plausible way, well, that was the best. I mean, in terms of statistics, of course, there is more recent attempts which are more sophisticated, and I would go, of course, for them rather than for these old-fashioned guys. But there is definitely something to be gained from that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. We have 3 minutes. Is there someone else who wants to share something? Comment, question, anything?
I could share something that is partly related to this discussion of Western sources. I recently read an interview with Kosov, who worked in Gosplan, and he said that, well, sometimes he was even reading Western statistics to better understand what was going on, to have kind of like extra view on the planification and the data, and also the forecasts that the American, even secret services, right, were preparing for the Soviet Union.
That's interesting. Yes, actually, here in Latin America, many people were reading what the Gosplan was doing, mainly in the 50s and the 60s. They were not only secretly, but of course there was a lot of reading of what was being done in Russia as well, in terms of seeing how you could plan something in the economy. So those readings were quite fluent all around the globe, and I think that's an interesting topic to expand on international influences, which are not always the ones that we assume they will be. And I think that's a very interesting topic to follow. Someone else? Well, I really want to thank you for having such an interesting session. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone has, and I hope as well that people who see this session later on, they will learn as well as much as I have as a chair. Thank you all for assisting.
Thank you.
And the HAS conference goes on tomorrow at 2 p.m. Utrecht time. Everybody do your maths for your times at home. And thank you very much again, and see you all on tomorrow's sessions.
Thank you for chairing. That was a
Thank you
pleasure.
for sharing, and have a good day, night, evening. Bye.
Evening.
Thank you to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to everyone. It was great. Bye.